Thank you. And in continuing on down the path of trying to take a look at governance relative to genetically engineered organisms, Jennifer Kuzma from North Carolina State University is going to have the floor next.
Great. Well, I also want to thank the committee and Lita for inviting me here today. I used to work in this building about 15 years ago as a study director for reports on genetic engineering and bioterrorism. So it's a pleasure to be back. I'm going to talk a bit more, I think, from a policy process level and a policy research and social science research perspective about governance. And I think my talk will fit with the other talks and hopefully will not duplicate, because I am so happy I don't have to talk about the coordinated framework now. So thank you, Andrew, because I'm tired of doing that. It's been 15 years. But I do want to define regulation, oversight, and governance. And I use the term governance as a broader term that includes not only top-down mandatory regulation, but also the norms, values, processes, and institutions that all have responsibility for overseeing, if you will, or watchful and responsible care of technologies. And so when I say governance, that's what I mean. I don't necessarily mean it comes from a really strong legal authority, including consumers have a role in governance as well, which I'll talk about. So yay, I don't have to talk about the coordinated framework, but let me just suffice it to say I believe it's unclear for genome editing in animals and plants. It has been demonstrated to be unclear, or at least a bit permissive. Unclear for animal research oversight and product oversight, which I thought I learned yesterday. That's not my area of expertise, the animal research oversight. So I'm happy to learn more about it, and I enjoyed those talks. But my area of expertise is more on the environmental and agricultural release of genetically engineered plants, animals, and microbes. So I wrote a chapter, I think it was 2 years ago, for a book that Gary Marchant put together about looking at the history of the coordinated framework and asking the question of how well did it keep pace with the changes in the technology from its origins to, oh, did I do something to turn it off? Well, anyway, I can keep talking. Is there an issue? Anyway, okay, so I wrote this chapter, and I identified in this book chapter 4 phases where the system used different policy tools in order to keep pace with the technology. And one of those was the first kind of policy tool that they used was coordination through interagency policymaking and the establishment of the coordinated framework. And that was in the development in the 1970s to the 80s when it was established. The second tool was more the formal guidance and the formal legal route, where they had to then promulgate rules under those particular, the OSTP guidance on the coordinated framework. Did I touch something here, Lita?
No.
Okay.
Yes,
okay, that's all right.
Sure.
I can keep going. I am gonna, well, I'll just keep going. I might have to pull my computer up because my memory, I'm getting old. So, you know, sometimes I don't remember what I have on my slides, especially when they were written at 5 o'clock in the morning. So the second phase was more of a formal top-down kind of promulgation of rules. The third, they did a lot of pacing when we had Starlink and pharmaceutical production and crops through guidance. And so they used kind of a different policy tool at that time. And then the fourth is what I'm calling revolution, which is kind of pacing in a very strange way, and I think we're still in that phase, but it's really going back to the definitions under the coordinated framework and reinterpreting them. So those were the questions that I asked in that book chapter. Just the screen, maybe? Okay, that's all right. You know, we'll do what we can. Oh, you had it. There we go. Yay. Okay. Thank you. Good. I don't have to rely on my memory. So revolution is more through this, what I'm calling pacing through power, or fundamental political and policy shifts. And when I started writing this chapter, I thought, did it pace with the technology? And actually it paced pretty well in keeping up with the issues and the problems. But then one has to ask the question of whether it properly paced. So yes, it was able to cover things as it went along, but did it do so in a responsible and way, a responsible and appropriate way? What happened at each one of these stages was conflict, and it usually came from external pressure. which led me to the conclusion that this has been really a system that changes upon conflict, and generally they're legal suits brought through NGOs or mishaps in the systems. So again, the contested system in the US, policy processes are contested in ways, and they're being more and more contested with the buying of local, natural, and organic foods, NGO legal suits concerning GM crops, recent labeling propositions, we all know this, delays in technological deployment, and companies actually starting to innovate around the regulatory definitions. And that wasn't the only reason that they pursued gene editing, obviously, but I've heard talks on active regulatory avoidance, and that term even used, not by companies, but by lawyers who have talked about how one might use certain kinds of plant pest proteins or sequences in order to question the capture by the regulatory system. And then USDA is deciding many crops are out of its scope. So we are in a contested system here. Is there any way I can get the slides on the screen too, so I don't have to go like this? It's not a big deal, but I'll just continue. So we had a big study funded by NSF on looking at systems of oversight for different products. And we did a multi-criteria evaluation, which is kind of what you do in policy research, is you use different types of criteria. And those values can include normative, value-based criteria. They can include empirical criteria and process criteria. And so in doing this process, my case study, it was a large team. We published several articles, a couple symposia of the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. And my was the GMO case study. And so again, this is statistics. We did expert and stakeholder subject matter elicitation, but these criteria travel together, and they're not distinct, and they're intertwined. So in other words, you know, it's again statistics, but we do a lot of things in natural science by statistics too, where public confidence was tied to and traveled with data requirements, incentives, and public input. So I don't want to make too much of this. I mean, the numbers aren't important. It's a exploratory hypothesis generating study rather than a confirmatory study. But we did find that in general, GMO oversight was highly flexible. That's how it could change and pace over time. It had a relatively clear subject, thank you, at the time, clear subject matter at the time. Now that's changing with these advent of genome editing and other techniques. A weak legal grounding, allowing for multiple interpretations, complex institutional structure. But again, it also had little transparency, a low level informed consent, few opportunities for public input, and low capacity. And so one questions whether this is the right way to proceed. So right about the time that that study was finishing up, I really have to commend Dan Voitis, who was one of the developers of Talon Technologies and zinc finger nuclease technologies, who came to me in 2008. And I was a social scientist that worked across the river at the University of Minnesota at the time. And he came to my office because he knew I was working on this kind of stuff. And he said, you know, how can we work together and to address, you know, I need to write this broader impact section for my grant. And so how can we work together? How can you help me address the broader impacts? So we started working on genome editing, but we called it targeted genetic modification. For like 3-4 years in all of our publications and things until genome editing really took off in gene editing. But we worked together for 4 years on a project looking at the landscape of gene editing, the scientific landscape, the interpretation and analysis of oversight systems, and expert visions of governance. So we did interviews, we had a workshop, we did surveys, and this was all very early, I think, you know, and our work pretty much ended long before this CRISPR thing took off. So we published, first of all, you know, a paper saying that many of these genome editing technologies might fall outside of the definition of genetic engineering. That's not news to you. But we also did some bibliometric analysis of the scientific, social science and natural science literature. And we found that it was a very concentrated, focusing on biomedical problems, few partnerships with LDCs at the time. Now this stopped in 2012 and 13, so I have to qualify that. Little collaboration among, you can also look at funding, who funded the studies if it's in the acknowledgements. Little collaboration among US funders, and then little safety research compared to the development funding. Now this is no surprise. I mean, in fact, the Woodrow Wilson Institute SynBio project just came out with a synthetic biology report where they estimate, and again, it's an estimate, that 1% of the funding is going to ethical, legal, and social science research in synthetic biology. 1%. So as a society, we have to ask, is that enough? I mean, that's a governance question, okay? So are we repeating, we're at risk of repeating the socio-political context of conflict and contention, is my premise there. We also did interviews with subject matter experts in the plant community. Again, I'm sorry, this is somewhat towards plants. The last study was not, but this one is. The interviews were more towards plants because that was what was going on at the time, mainly. And we found that the understandings of the technology, even among subject matter experts, did not map neatly onto governance preferences. And I want to just go through a few narratives of change. So this has been published in the Bulletin of Science, Technology, and Society. So many people had the same concerns in comparison to regular genetic engineering, but some had more problematic concerns and some had less. Attitudes about the current oversight system, most were not satisfied and most would want changes to it in the face of this gene editing, although we called it Takehome, as you can see. So key narratives that came across in that, I don't have the screen anymore, so I've got to look up. Gene editing is an incremental, so here are some of the narratives. So what you look for in qualitative analysis from interviews is you look at kind of the counts of the themes, but you also can look at what are the narratives that are emerging. And so a couple of the narratives that were emerging, gene editing is an incremental technology. Maybe it doesn't change the technological concerns dramatically, but it gives us an opportunity to re-examine governance. And the diversity of changes suggested, they range from more relaxed to more rigorous. I call that the pragmatist opportunist kind of narrative. And then there were other narratives of gene editing as a revolutionary technology, and it's dramatically different and it forces a change. And then one has to ask how. It relaxes, in many cases, the need for oversight, or it could intensify the need for oversight. I call the relaxes the hyper-technology, hypo-regulation argument, which is, this technology is new and powerful, but it doesn't need to be regulated. It's also a process-based argument. So I'd be careful about, arguing that it's product, not process, and then saying that all gene editing needs to be exempt. It's a bit, I'm not sure if that's congruent. Or there's this argument that it intensifies the need for oversight. And that wasn't so much that it's incredibly dangerous or I don't like it. These, are subject matter experts after all. Although, we still have biases and we still have cultural attitudes, right? But it was more from a systems perspective. So I want to talk about, here's one quote from that. As we're able to have more and more powerful techniques to modify these plants, we will be able to modify them more and more from their standard configurations, especially with gene addition, when you use editing to have cargo and put it in, which might come from another species, and it's not just a simple mutation. We can completely rewire a number of these plants. The one concern I have is that we're creating plants before we really know what the sorts of products are. And then you have kind of the opposite view, is all you've done is taken a few bases out, which fundamentally changed the physiology, but there's no clear pathway by which that plant would or would not be considered. This was back in 2012 or so, maybe even 11, we did the interviews. So I think we'll probably see significantly streamlined approval processes. And actually, one thing that we're hoping for as a business is that the regulatory hurdles will be raised for GM plants that are not made using technologies like ours. So a lot of interesting kind of quotes that you get, right? And you don't identify the people, so you're all safe, even though some of you were there. But another systems perspective that I want to talk about is the system that I'm not showing a quote from, is the idea that the system would be overwhelmed by the number of products. And I think that the person, Andrew, might have mentioned that. I think it was Andrew, or it might have been Carolyn. Anyway, but the points of agreement in the quantitative survey, and again, this is about 40 people, so it's not, statistically valid. It might have been at the time a statistically valid sample of the number of experts in the area at that time, though. The majority agree that mistakes were made with first generation. Majority would prefer some level of pre-market review. Majority acknowledge that more stakeholders and citizens need to be informed. But what are we doing in the US? And this is my view of the world, of course, I have my own biases. Government in the plant arena deciding not to capture, including genome-edited plants, and and sometimes at all, even if it's not genome edited and it's not a plant pest, doesn't have plant pest sequences anymore. That was a huge decision. Back in 2000, when I worked in this building, we had conversations with the people involved in the coordinated framework who said, no, the plant pest statute is just a hook. We're going to regulate all transgenic plants. So that's a political shift. Okay? And again, that comes from the flexibility of interpretation. And it comes from external socio-political factors. That's my premise anyway. Making decisions largely in private, lack of advisory or stakeholder committees. This is on the USDA side primarily, and not, the Salmon Act obviously went through a rigorous advisory committee process. I'm talking more about gene-edited plants now. And until recently, there weren't many opportunities to just kind of discuss, how are we going to treat these? The first opportunity came on October 30th, where I got 2 weeks notice in the middle of a semester when I'm, teaching classes and trying to keep up with everything, that there would be a meeting in Washington, D.C. And I regret it, but I wasn't able to come and comment. So one of my pleas is, let's get the voice of some of the academic social scientists and ethicists and policy thinkers and historians in that conversation about the coordinated framework. Not necessarily me, you don't have to invite me. I've got enough to do. I'd like to come, but you don't have to. But let's at least get that voice, right? Okay, and you're gonna miss that voice if you put out 2 weeks notice for a public meeting. In the middle of the semester especially. And the US was largely working outside of international processes in many cases. And then developers, I've already talked about the contention and the kind of appealing to sound science, which I'll talk about in my last 9 minutes, and appealing to the product, not a process, as to why gene editing shouldn't be regulated, but I'd be careful about that again for the reason I stated. It might be inconsistent. And it also has tended to be in our US system a code for limiting oversight to direct human health and environmental harms. And I think Alta asked that question this morning. And so, what else can we consider in the oversight system? And I'm going to argue that we should consider more than that, and I'll tell you why. I was supposed to talk about harmonization, so I threw one slide on gene editing in there. So harmonization, we're also I don't know if our approach is going to be consistent on an international level, and I think Andrew pointed out nicely, because we're not participating in the CBD as a full ratified member, that this could become problematic, but it seems as countries are taking different routes to thinking about these different site-directed nuclease technologies. And I think, is harmonization, another question I was asked to address, is harmonization desirable? I think yes, but we also have to recognize the value differences in multiple countries, just like we kind of did with the WTO TRIPS agreement. One could argue whether we did or not, but we did to some extent with those kinds of things. Okay, but what I really want to get to in my last 8 minutes is, why is our current approach problematic from a social science perspective? Number one, there are different scientific conceptions of risk. Ortman Wren, who's at the meeting that I'm kind of bouncing back between Society for Risk Analysis meeting across town this week, wrote a really nice paper talking about the different conceptions of risk. And this, I don't think we can say as a scientific community, and I used to be a biochemist who made engineered things, that our definition of risk is the right one and the only one that can be considered. There are harms and damages that can occur, other harms and damages, first order, which we do cover quite well in our regulatory system. Second order, though, systems-wide. My talk on the other end of town was on systems mapping for risk analysis of gene drives. And if I went through the Australian CERO report, and I went through the USDA diamondback moth and medfly and pink bollworm, and kind of tried to piece together some thinking about systems, the fault tree that the Australians did is really beautiful. It takes into consideration social, economic, ecological harm. It doesn't have numbers, of course, but really they laid out the factors very nicely in that, if you're looking for something. So are we considering social structure harm, ethical affronts, psychological well-being, animal well-being, which I have on a subsequent slide, financial impacts, even indirect or organic farmers, cultural disruption? And why is only one definition of risk the right one? I just want to throw that out there. Okay, second, there's values inherent in the risk assessment process. I used to do risk analysis. I did farm-to-table food safety microbial risk analysis at the USDA. And trust me, there are values. It's an art. And even the people at the Society for Risk Analysis would admit this. Endpoints chosen. Even if you're trying to be as objective and balanced as you possibly can, the endpoints that you choose is a value judgment. The interpreting the data is a value judgment. What time scale and geographic regions, choice of your baseline, what are you comparing it to? Decision options and scenarios that you choose are value judgments. And of course, ecological economics with discount rates and everything else is very much so a value judgment. And here's just an example of dose response curves. You know, your data is usually up here, but you're really more worried about these low level chronic exposures over time. And so there's a whole subgroup across town working on dose response assessment since SRA was born. And how do you draw these lines? Okay. So enough said about that. The other thing, risk management is always value laden. If you don't believe me about the risk assessment, believe me about the risk management, okay? And there's always risk and uncertainty. Nothing is ever without risk except the, dying maybe. I don't know. If you can think of something without risk, let me know. Precaution is not necessarily anti-science. Sometimes it can be, especially when it attacks people or is unfair in its attacks. But for many, it's a belief about risk governance. And so is anti-precaution. The product versus process binary frame is not really all that helpful because it leads to almost a logical conclusion that you should regulate all of them or none of them, and those are your main options. Because you're doing the risk assessment after the product is somewhat captured, okay? Or you're submitting it. I mean, you might argue with me on this, and I would accept many arguments against this particular point, but I'm trying to think about this. Regardless, with gene editing and especially CRISPR gene drives, the process matters because the gene itself, the drive itself, is designed in a different way to do a different thing that has consequences down the road. That is not to say that we should capture all genetically engineered things. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that this distinction that we've been talking about for 25 years is not all that helpful, and it's not getting us anywhere. And it doesn't make one side smarter than the other. And then huge debates, of course, stem from differences in worldviews about government regulation and the level of precaution. And who's right and who's wrong, I don't know, but there's a range of values. I already said that. Okay, so in gene editing and drives, the ethical dimensions that come into this, you all are more experts on that than I am. So I'm not going to cover what we've already covered. Just to say that there's even different ways of thinking about ethics and having those arguments. And sometimes we, as an expert committee or community, are arguing in a utilitarian perspective, but people are arguing from a procedural or an ethics of care or principles or rights-based perspectives. And I'm going to skip the gene drive stuff because Andrew introduced it. This is a typology I developed for gene drives. I very much agree with Anne and others who have said product matters, though. I want to make sure that's product matters for what you're looking at. But for the capture, you can't capture it by a product. Capture has to have some other value attached to it. But then the focus should be on the characteristics of the product. So I developed a typology for a paper that's in review on kinds of gene drives and different purposes and different populations carrying them. And Anne's typology of animal gene editing was also very nice. So typologies, I think, are very helpful in having in-depth conversations about what's in and what's out. And we don't have to have a micro level of everything, like we have to look at everything, or we have to look at nothing. We can have certain categories, I think. So there's a middle ground here as to product and process that I think we need to talk more about instead of having the poles of product and process. And I think typologies are helpful in that regard. And then I just wanted to give a nod that I do think about animal welfare, even though it's not my subject of expertise. And especially with gene drives, I'll just raise questions that are a bit different. We have a cohort of PhD students thinking about, they did a case study, a theoretical case study on the deployment of rats on islands to bring down the rat population. And so they asked the questions in their website, which is on our center's website, the Genetic Engineering and Society Center that I co-direct. They have a whole website about this case study. If you're interested, I'd be happy to direct you to it. But they asked the question, does the animal have rights not to be engineered and kill its kin, okay? I'm not the expert on animal ethics and welfare, but that's a question I think that might be a little bit new for gene drives in that island context. And then, of course, the suffering question that Art and others have already covered so well. So what do we do about this? And then I just want to make the view, people are not irrational. They do get it. I've had many taxi cab driver conversations. I've been to science museums. They can get it with a little bit of information. And they base their views on a variety of factors, just like we do, and that not necessarily irrational. Paul Slovic, who's at the meeting again across the street, came up with this nice psychometric paradigm where there's uncontrollability and unknownness that really come into play there. That's not necessarily irrational if you're especially under conditions of uncertainty. And then I've written a paper recently on kind of a skepticism and altruism. People really will accept GM foods, most people, we've done a national survey, that have strong benefits to people who need them, health and welfare benefits to people that need them. So that's kind of the altruism sort of factor. Skepticism's a bit different than trust. People in our focus groups are very skeptical of the system. Not necessarily mistrust of a particular organization or individual, but things are just not going to happen how they, in a broad sense, say they're going to happen. So I called that something different than trust. I call it skepticism. So that's kind of a blend between some cultural cognition hypotheses on risk perception and psychometric. So those are my pleas for why we need. So my take-home message is we need to move from a pure science-based to a science-informed and value-attentive and public respectful oversight. It's not all about messaging or understanding what the public attitudes are so we can, work around them or tweak them or change them. It's about listening, dialogue, and mutual social and bi-directional learning. The NRC wrote a great report, Analytical Deliberative Process of Risk Analysis, that is still, I think, a very good model for this kind of thing, where it's not like people voting on the dose response curve, but you have a deliberation, the analysts go off and do their thing for a while, to frame the issues you would deliberate, to choose endpoints you would deliberate, then you'd have analysis, and then you'd have reporting and deliberation again, and then analysis and reporting, and it would be this iterative feedback process. So the models in the literature, will this prompt a change in governance? The policy window is cracking. So I also teach policy process theory, and there's the agenda setting theory. The policy window is cracking now with gene editing and gene drives. We've got this OSTP memo. We've got greater recognition of the problem, and there are plenty of policy options out there in the academic literature and the think tank literature and the government literature. And industry literature too. So we are not at a loss for policy stream or problem stream, but what I worry about is the political stream. And will there be the will to govern? Will there be willingness to listen to value perspectives that may question a mainstream techno-optimism or technology always equals social good paradigm? And then I was going to show some paradigms of governance, but I'll save those for another talk. But what I'm really talking about here is the middle ground between only the process matters and we don't like GM process, and the con of obviously it can stall technology development, and only the products matter and impacts. And then again, we don't have enough risk science sometimes to determine that. There's a little bit of a hypocrisy and a lack of trust. And so I'm looking for, these are kind of some models. Responsible innovation is a big one now in the literature that can help us reach a middle ground. And I'm going to stop there and not show the models because I'm over time. So here I click with my little animation. This was when animation was big a couple of years ago. It's not so big anymore. And I'll just go straight to the acknowledgements. So thank you.